the greatest empires of the ancient world vanished in the blink of an eye. Within a single generation, the mighty Hittite, Mycenaean, and Egyptian realms shattered, their palaces left in ashes and their voices silenced. This was the Late Bronze Age collapse, a profound turning point that reset the course of civilization, and at the center of the mystery waits a shadowy force called the Sea Peoples. By the end of this exploration, you will understand how a band of mysterious raiders may have triggered the downfall of an entire age. We will decipher ancient warnings carved in stone, walk through the scorched layers of fallen cities, and piece together a puzzle of migration and chaos. How does a society that seems unshakable suddenly come apart at the seams around 1200 years before the Common Era? The Mediterranean world was a place of astonishing connection. This was a true international age, a web of kingdoms and empires linked by royal letters written on clay tablets, by cargo ships laden with precious metals, and by diplomats who spoke a shared language of power and prestige. To the north in Anatolia stood the Hittite Empire, a formidable military power whose smiths were pioneering the use of iron and whose archives held some of the world's oldest known peace treaties. Across the Aegean Sea, the citadels of Mycenaean Greece, like Mycenaean, were adorned with gold and frescoes, their rulers controlling a network of palace workshops that produced fine pottery and olive oil for export. Along the coast of the Levant, vibrant ports like Ugarit in modern-day Syria bustled as commercial hubs, their scribes recording transactions in a dozen different languages. And to the south, the new kingdom of Egypt under great pharaohs like the second reached the peak of its wealth and influence, its granaries full, and its temples colossal monuments to a seemingly. These were not isolated civilizations. They were deeply interdependent partners in a vast economic system. Ships crisscrossed the sea, carrying not just goods but ideas. Copper from Cyprus, tin from distant Anatolia or beyond, essential for making bronze, moved along established routes. Luxury items like Egyptian glass, Mycenaean pottery, and Canaanite purple dye were exchanged as royal gifts that cemented alliances. This was a delicate equilibrium of diplomacy and trade, a complex dance that had maintained a general stability for centuries. It was a world that felt permanent, sophisticated, and deeply interconnected. Yet this very web of connection, this strength of the age, would become its greatest vulnerability when the threads began to snap. The stability of the entire system rested on the smooth functioning of every part, and a shock to one corner could ripple outward with catastrophic speed. But this sophisticated world of kings and commerce did not last. The first cracks appeared not with a single cataclysm, but as a distant rumble, a series of unsettling reports that began to filter into the royal courts. Our clearest and most dramatic window into this gathering storm comes from the very civilization that managed to survive it, though not unscathed. To understand the Sea Peoples, we must first listen to the story told by their most famous opponent and walk the walls of a temple built to proclaim an empire's desperate victory. On the west bank of the Nile, at a site called, stands the massive mortuary temple of Pharaoh III. Its walls are not just stone, they are a canvas of calculated triumph. Here, in sweeping, chaotic reliefs, we see the earliest detailed portraits of the crisis. One scene shows a naval battle of terrifying confusion. Egyptian ships with archers in their rigging grapple with enemy vessels, their prows carved into the heads of strange birds or beasts. The water is thick with fallen warriors. On another wall, a land battle rages. Egyptian infantry and chariots clash with a motley array of foes. Some fight from ox-drawn carts piled high with belongings, women and children huddled within, suggesting these were not just raiders, but entire peoples on the move. The accompanying hieroglyphs are just as vital as the images. They name the enemy, listing a confederation of groups, who scholars strongly associate with the later Philistines of the Bible, the, and others. The inscription boasts of how the third crushed them utterly, claiming he stood like a wall of metal against the invading nations. This is our most vivid evidence, but it is crucial to remember its purpose. This is not a neutral historical report. It is state propaganda, designed for eternity to proclaim the pharaoh's divine power and his role as the protector of cosmic order from the chaos of foreign invasion. To find a quieter, earlier glimpse of the trouble, we must look back a generation before the third, to the reign of Pharaoh. A victory stele from his 5th year records a different kind of fight. Here, the pharaoh repels a major invasion from Libya, but the text notably mentions that among the Libyan allies were fighters from the north, from across the sea. It lists some of the same names, like the and the, calling them peoples of the sea. This earlier reference is more ambiguous, less dramatic than the full-blown invasions would face, but it is profoundly telling. It suggests that decades before the collapse reached its peak, these seaborne groups were already active, already forming alliances and testing the frontiers of the great empires. They were not a sudden hurricane, but a storm that had been building for a long time, glimpsed first in the margins of older victory monuments before erupting across the entire temple wall. Yet the true scale of the disaster is not found in royal boasts, but in the silent, scorched earth. To understand what really happened, we must look past the temple walls and into the ground itself, at a phenomenon archaeologists call the destruction layer. This is not a metaphor, it is a physical, tangible stratum of history, a dark line in the soil that marks a violent and abrupt end. At site after site across the eastern Mediterranean, from the Levant to Anatolia to Greece, excavators digging down through the centuries find the same grim story. They reach a level dating to around 1200 to 1150 years before the Common Era, and there it is, a compacted layer of charcoal, crumbled turned to reddish slag by intense heat, shattered pottery. And the skeletal remains of collapsed buildings. This is the archaeological smoking gun. Consider the great port city of Ugarit in modern-day Syria. One of the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan hubs of the age, its final moments are preserved in heartbreaking detail. The city was not just damaged, it was utterly consumed. The royal palace and its surrounding districts were reduced to a uniform blanket of ash and debris. Within that layer, archaeologists found something uniquely chilling: the baked clay tablets of the city's final correspondence. Unlike papyrus, fire hardened these clay letters, preserving desperate last words. One message, sent to the king of Cyprus, pleads for help, reporting that the enemy's ships have already been sighted. Another, perhaps the last ever filed in the Ugaritic archives, states bluntly that all the city's troops and chariots are away on campaign, and the remaining ships are stationed in distant Lydia. The city was defenseless. The letters were never sent. Ugarit was erased, its vibrant international trade and its libraries of literature vanishing into that single, ashy stratum. This pattern repeats with haunting consistency. Far to the north, in the rugged highlands of Anatolia, stood the formidable capital of the Hittite Empire. This was no minor outpost, but a sprawling, fortified city of temples and granaries, the nerve center of a military superpower. Yet here, too, archaeologists uncover a terminal destruction layer. The city's mighty walls were breached, its palaces and temples set ablaze. The evidence suggests the fires were so hot they and melted metal. After this cataclysm, was not rebuilt. The Hittite imperial administration, along with its complex legal codes and diplomatic archives, ceased to exist. The silence that followed was absolute. Across the Aegean Sea, the story is the same. In Greece, the palace of the legendary King Nestor, a center of Mycenaean administration, met a fiery end. Excavations reveal a layer of destruction so complete that it left behind only shattered frescoes and broken tablets in a script called Linear B in many of these places, from coastal towns to inland capitals. The destruction layer shows no signs of gradual decay or economic decline leading up to the event. The cities were often at their peak of wealth and complexity when the blow fell. This is what makes the evidence so compelling and so ominous. We are not looking at the slow dimming of a light, but at lights being violently snuffed out, one after another, in a terrifyingly short span of time. These parallel layers of ash form a map of calamity. They tell us that the crisis was not a local war or a single unfortunate earthquake, which might topple one city but leave others untouched. This was a widespread, near simultaneous wave of violence that swept across the entire interconnected world. The burning of palace archives, like those at Ugarit, provides the chilling human context, a snapshot of societies caught in a sudden, catastrophic crisis they could neither comprehend nor withstand. When you stand before that dark line in the soil, you are standing at the precise moment a world ended. But who, or what, could deliver such a coordinated, civilization-ending blow? The search for an answer leads us from the ruins themselves to the turbulent world that may have created the destroyers. The names carved at are our only direct link to these shadowy invaders, but they are names given by their enemies, labels of conquest, not self-identification. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples, a collective term that has echoed through history, but modern scholars warn us this is a catch-all phrase, a convenient box for what was likely a complex and shifting coalition. The inscriptions list specific groups, the, and the, among others. Each name represents a separate puzzle. Who were they and where did they come from? The most famous of these groups are the. Their connection is one of the few with a strong scholarly consensus, as they are almost certainly the Philistines of later biblical fame, who settled on the southern coast of Canaan. Their material culture, particularly a distinct style of pottery with close parallels to types found in the Aegean world, suggests an origin somewhere in that sphere, perhaps the Greek mainland or the islands. Other names hint at wider geographies. They are often linked to a region in southwestern Anatolia known from Hittite records as a sometimes troublesome land. They appear in earlier Egyptian art as mercenaries with distinctive horned helmets, possibly from Sardinia, though that connection is debated. They might relate to Sicily, and a Homeric name for the Greeks themselves. This is the great detective work of history, trying to match ancient Egyptian exonyms, names given by outsiders, with known places and peoples. But the map it produces is frustratingly vast, pointing not to a single homeland, but to a scattering of potential origins across the entire Mediterranean. This is the core of the identity problem. Were the Sea Peoples a unified army with a common goal, or a desperate confederation of refugees, displaced by some earlier calamity? Were they professional pirates seizing a moment of imperial weakness, or entire communities on the move, their ox carts carrying families and all their worldly goods, as the Egyptian relief suggests? The Egyptian records provide no clear answer about their homeland, only that they came from the islands and coasts to the north. They are defined solely by their action, by the chaos they brought. To move beyond these ancient labels, we must look past the words of the pharaohs and examine the physical traces the invaders left behind, the fragments of their world that survived the fires they themselves may have set. The Egyptian reliefs show them as invaders, but the artifacts they left behind tell a more nuanced story. To see the Sea Peoples not just as a force of destruction, but as people building new lives, we must look at what they created after the fires cooled. In the southern coastal plain of Canaan, in the decades following the Great Collapse, archaeologists uncover a striking change in the material record. The local Canaanite pottery, with its familiar forms and decorations, is suddenly joined by a completely new style. This is Philistine pottery, and it is a revelation. It features bold, spiraling designs, images of birds and fish, and a distinctive two-color geometric decoration that is utterly foreign to the region. To experts, this pottery is a clear cultural fingerprint. Its closest parallels are found hundreds of miles away, in the Mycenaean world of the Aegean. This is not loot plundered from a burning palace. This is the domestic ware of a people settling in, making cooking pots, storage jars, and drinking cups in the aesthetic tradition of their homeland. It is the physical evidence of a transplanted culture putting down roots. This discovery fundamentally shifts the narrative. The group the Egyptians called who we know as the Philistines, were not just passing through on a raid, they came to stay. The theory of a mass migration, long hinted at by those ox carts in the reliefs, gains powerful support from the earth itself. Imagine not an army, but a flotilla of ships carrying not only warriors, but also potters, farmers, metalworkers, and families. They were likely displaced themselves, their own homes perhaps falling victim to the same widespread instability they are accused of causing. They were not merely agents of chaos, they were also its products, caught in a domino effect of collapse that pushed populations across the Mediterranean in search of stable ground. The line between attacker and refugee becomes impossibly blurred. Were they conquering a new land, or desperately claiming one because they had nowhere else to go? The aftermath in the Levant reveals a fascinating process of cultural fusion, not just replacement. Over the generations following their settlement, that distinctive Philistine pottery begins to change. The purely Aegean styles slowly incorporate local Canaanite influences, evolving into a unique hybrid tradition. Their cities, show a blend of architectural ideas. They adopted the local language eventually, and their gods sometimes merged with Canaanite deities. This was not a wholesale erasure of the past, but the difficult, messy birth of something new from the ashes of the old. The Sea Peoples in this light become agents of profound change. They were the end of one world, yes, but also the hesitant beginning of another. They brought their recipes, their weaving patterns, their stories, and their skills, weaving them into the fabric of a recovering landscape. Their story transforms from a simple tale of villains and victims into a complex saga of human resilience, adaptation, and the relentless search for home amidst a shattered world. If some groups were migrating to build anew, it forces us to ask a deeper, more unsettling question. What could have been so terrible, so inescapable? In their own homelands that would compel entire peoples to risk everything on a desperate journey across the sea, the true power of the late Bronze Age world was not in its stone walls, but in its invisible threads. Think of it as the first globalized economy, a delicate clockwork of specialized parts. Cyprus mined the copper. Distant lands in Anatolia and possibly beyond supplied the rare tin. Combined in the right ratio, these metals became bronze, the very lifeblood of the age, essential for everything from a farmer's plow to a king's spear. Egypt, with the fertile Nile Valley, acted as the granary, its surplus grain a vital commodity shipped across the sea. This system was a masterpiece of interdependence, but it had a critical weakness. Its most vital connections were physical and shockingly vulnerable. They were the coastal ports and the trade routes that linked them. A city like Ugarit was not just a place. It was a vital node in this network, a bustling switchboard where goods, information, and credit were exchanged. Now imagine the impact of a single, devastating raid on such a hub. When the ships of the Sea Peoples struck Ugarit, they did more than burn a palace. They severed a major artery. A shipment of tin sitting in its harbor might never sail. Without that tin, a bronze workshop in a Mycenaean palace hundreds of miles away grinds to a halt. Suddenly, a local king cannot equip his new regiment of soldiers with proper weapons. His military power, a key pillar of his authority, begins to erode. This is the domino effect in its form. A collapse in one corner of the system triggers failures in another, and another, until the entire structure groans under the strain. The raids themselves were a terrifying immediate crisis, but the economic strangulation that followed was a slower, deeper catastrophe. As piracy made the sea lanes perilous, merchants stopped risking their ships and their cargoes. Long-distance trade, the engine of royal wealth and prestige, simply froze. The consequences rippled inward into the very heart of each kingdom. Consider the palatial economies of the Mycenaeans or the Hittites. These were not market-based systems, but centralized bureaucracies. The palace collected raw materials, redistributed food and goods, and supported specialized classes of artisans who created luxury items. This entire structure was fueled by imported materials and financed by the control of trade. When those imports stopped, the system seized up. Artisans found themselves without work. Scribes had nothing to record. The elites, whose power was demonstrated through the display of exotic goods, faced a crisis of legitimacy. They could no longer reward their followers with gifts of fine metalwork or rare textiles. Even more fundamentally, the disruption of sea travel threatened the most basic need, food. If Egyptian grain could not be safely shipped to a drought-stricken Hittite region, or if local harvests were destroyed by raiders, famine followed. Hunger is a powerful catalyst for social unrest. A population facing scarcity quickly loses faith in rulers who can no longer provide security or bread. The scribe, the soldier, the farmer, and the king all found themselves caught in the same tightening vice. The raids by the Sea Peoples did not need to conquer every city to topple empires. They only needed to attack the right points, the vulnerable nodes in a hyper-connected system. By disrupting trade, they triggered internal economic failures, social fragmentation, and a loss of faith in the old order. The world did not just fall to invaders, it crumbled from within, its foundations starved of the connections that once made it strong. This raises a pivotal question. If the system was so fragile, what initial push could have set such a devastating chain of events into motion? A society can withstand a single blow. But what happens when every pillar begins to crack at once? The raids of the Sea Peoples were the visible flashpoint, but to understand why the entire system shattered, we must look at the invisible pressures building beneath the surface. The latest science offers a startling clue, one locked not in clay tablets, but in the silent rings of ancient trees and the frozen layers of polar ice. Analyses of these natural archives reveal a profound and prolonged period of climate instability, beginning around 1200 years before the Common Era. The Mediterranean world, for several decades, was gripped by severe drought. Think of the lifeblood of these empires, not as gold or bronze, but as water. The Nile's predictable floods, the rains that watered the Hittite farmlands, the seasonal patterns that sailors relied upon, all faltered. A single failed harvest could be managed from stored surplus, but year after year of diminished rainfall would have emptied royal granaries and turned fertile plains to dust. The consequences are not hard to reconstruct. Famine follows drought. Hunger drives people from their ancestral lands in search of food and survival. This creates waves of internal migration, displaced populations pressing against the borders of already strained kingdoms. It is a compelling and deeply human scenario. Many of the groups later labeled Sea Peoples may have begun their journeys not as conquerors, but as climate refugees, desperate communities pushed from their homes in Anatolia, the Aegean, or elsewhere by an environmental catastrophe they could not control. Their movement would have itself become a source of instability, a domino falling against the next. Yet even a changing climate does not doom a healthy society on its own. Resilience is built into human communities. The true tragedy of the late Bronze Age collapse lies in how these external shocks exposed fatal weaknesses that had been growing within the empires themselves. Consider the sheer scale of their ambitions. The Hittite Empire was overextended, trying to control a vast, mountainous territory with limited communication. Egypt, though wealthy, faced constant pressure on its frontiers. Maintaining the sprawling palaces, the professional armies, and the complex bureaucracies required immense and constant revenue, all dependent on that fragile web of international trade. Within these societies, inequality was likely stark. The opulence of the palace, with its frescoes and gold, stood in contrast to the life of the common farmer. In good times, this social contract held. But when the rains failed and the ships stopped coming, that contract broke. A ruling class that could no longer provide security or food quickly lost its divine mandate to rule. The very bureaucracy that made the system efficient also made it rigid. A centralized palace economy could not easily adapt to sudden, systemic shock. There were no backup plans, no decentralized networks to fall back on when the center could no longer hold. So we see a perfect storm converging. From the environment came drought, famine, and desperate migration. From within the empires came overextension, social strain, and systemic fragility. The Sea Peoples entered this landscape not as an unstoppable supernatural force, but as a catalyst. They were the spark that fell onto a landscape already baked dry and piled high with tinder. Their attacks on coastal cities did not just burn buildings, they severed the last functioning arteries of a body already in crisis. They pushed societies that were teetering, societies already struggling with hunger and internal doubt, finally over the edge. The collapse, therefore, was not a simple case of invaders destroying peaceful victims. It was a catastrophic intersection of human and natural forces, where a changing world met civilizations too rigid to bend, and where the search for survival by some meant the end of everything for others. This realization shifts the mystery from a question of who the destroyers were, to a more profound question about the nature of civilization itself. How does any complex society, including our own, balance interconnection with resilience? The Hittite Empire was the first great domino to fall. Nestled in the rugged highlands of central Anatolia, far from the sea, its capital seemed impregnable. This was no minor city, but a sprawling fortress of cyclopean stone walls, grand temples, and vast underground granaries designed to withstand long sieges. Its archives held thousands of clay tablets detailing laws, treaties, and diplomatic correspondence, the administrative heartbeat of a military superpower. Yet when the end came, it was both total and final. The city was not just conquered, it was utterly consumed by fire and then abandoned. The silence that followed is one of history's most profound, because the Hittites themselves, the masters of this inland realm, left us no story of their own demise. Their perspective is the great missing chapter in the saga of the collapse, and to understand why, we must look at the very geography that once made them strong. Its greatest strength was also its fatal flaw. Landlocked and remote, the empire's prosperity depended entirely on long, vulnerable supply lines stretching to the coast. For access to the vital sea lanes of the Mediterranean, the Hittites relied on a network of allied port cities, with Ugarit being one of the most crucial. Through Ugarit, Hittite merchants could export Anatolian silver and wool, and import the essentials they lacked, particularly tin for bronze and, in lean years, Egyptian grain. This was a partnership of mutual benefit, but it made the Hittite economy exquisitely sensitive to shocks at the coastline. When the ships of the Sea Peoples began ravaging the shores of the Levant, they were not just attacking foreign cities, they were surgically severing the Hittite Empire's economic arteries. The desperate, unsent letters found in the ashes of Ugarit represent more than one city's cry for help. They are the sound of a lifeline being cut. With its coastal gateways shattered, was suddenly isolated, a powerful heart with no way to receive oxygen. Internal pressures were already straining that heart. Tree ring data from the region confirms a period of severe and prolonged drought in Anatolia right at this time. For an agricultural society, even one with massive grain storage, consecutive years of failed harvests would have emptied reserves and sparked widespread hardship. A hungry population is a restless one, and a ruler who cannot provide food quickly loses legitimacy. At the same time, the Hittite military, famed for its chariots and iron working, was stretched dangerously thin. The empire faced threats on multiple frontiers, from rival kingdoms to rebellious subject states. Maintaining this constant military commitment required steady revenue from trade, the very revenue that was now disappearing as the coasts fell into chaos. The empire was caught in a tightening vice, squeezed by environmental stress from within and economic strangulation from without. The final act that remains shrouded in mystery. The archaeological layer shows evidence of a catastrophic fire so intense it brick and melted metal. But who set the blaze? It could have been the Sea Peoples themselves, pushing inland after destroying the ports. It could have been invading groups from the north or west, taking advantage of the empire's weakness. Or, in a grimly plausible scenario, it could have been internal rebellion, a desperate population or disaffected garrison turning on the capital that could no longer feed or protect them. We simply do not know because the last keepers of the records, the palace scribes, perished in the flames. The burning of the archives was more than a loss of buildings, it was the silencing of a civilization's voice. The Hittite version of events, their own account of the drought, the famine, and the final days, turned to dust and clay. Their story survives only in fragments mentioned in the letters of others, making their colossal fall feel even more abrupt and absolute. The aftermath of their disappearance reshaped the ancient world. The sudden vacuum of power in Anatolia left a splintered landscape of smaller, fragmented kingdoms and nomadic groups. This political fragmentation made the entire region less stable for centuries, altering trade routes and cultural exchange. The fall of the Hittites demonstrated with terrifying clarity how the collapse of one critical node, especially a major inland empire dependent on coastal links, could trigger a wider cascade. Their demise did not just mean the end of a kingdom, it meant the rupture of an entire sector of the international system, sending shockwaves that would be felt from Mesopotamia to the Aegean. If the mighty Hittites, with all their fortifications and military prowess, could vanish so completely, what hope did any of the other interconnected kingdoms have? The answer would unfold in a wave of fire that reached the very heart of the Greek world. Across the Aegean Sea, the collapse took on a different character, one of fading complexity rather than a single, fiery cataclysm. The Mycenaean world was a civilization of warriors and traders. its kings ruling from hilltop citadels like Mycenae, the legendary home of Agamemnon, and the palace of the wise King Nestor. These were not just fortresses, but the pulsating hearts of a highly organized society. Their true nature is revealed not in Homer's epic poetry, but in the thousands of clay tablets inscribed with a script called Linear B. These records are administrative, not literary. They are meticulous inventories, counting every jar of olive oil, every chariot wheel, every measure of bronze, and even the names of individual workers and their rations. This was a command economy of astonishing detail, a top-heavy system where the palace controlled nearly every aspect of production and distribution. The wealth it managed was real, as the golden death masks and finely frescoed walls attest, but its strength was brittle, dependent on the uninterrupted flow of goods and authority. When that flow was disrupted, the entire structure had no way to adapt. The question that haunts these ruins is whether the end came from a foreign sword or from a rebellion within the very walls the system was built to control. The physical evidence at many sites is dramatic and familiar. A thick destruction layer seals the final days of the palace. The Linear B tablets, originally stored in wooden boxes, were baked hard by the Inferno, preserving the palace's last fiscal year in an accidental kiln. At Mycenaean, massive walls were breached and grand halls reduced to rubble. For a long time, scholars pointed to these layers and the widespread pattern as clear proof of an external invasion, likely by the sea peoples mentioned in Egyptian records. It seemed a straightforward narrative, a wave of destruction washing over Greece from the sea. Yet, as archaeologists looked closer, the story grew more complicated. At some key sites, there is a curious lack of evidence for a prolonged siege or a concentrated battle. Weapons are not found scattered in the streets, and in some places, valuable objects seem to have been removed before the fires were set. This has led to a compelling alternative theory that the final blow may have been struck not by outsiders, but by the society's own people. Could the highly centralized Mycenaean system have sparked its own downfall? The Linear B tablets offer a clue. They reveal a society with a stark hierarchy. At the top were the king and a class of elite officials. Below them was a vast substratum of craftsmen, farmers, and laborers, many of whom were tied to the palace, their work and rations meticulously recorded. This system functioned beautifully when the trade networks were open, bringing in luxury goods for the elite and essential materials like tin for the artisans. But what happened when those networks failed? When ships from the east stopped coming, the palace's wealth would have evaporated. The bronze workshops would have fallen silent for lack of materials. The king could no longer reward his followers with prestige goods. More critically, if environmental stress led to poor harvests, the palace might have been unable to provide the food rations it promised to the thousands who depended on it. A populace that is hungry and whose social contract with its rulers has broken is a powder keg. The oppressed lower class, or perhaps even disgruntled mid-level officials, could have risen up, looting the storerooms and burning the symbols of their oppression, the palaces themselves. The most likely scenario is a devastating combination of both forces. Initial raids by seaborne groups, whether called sea peoples or not, would have crippled coastal trade and sowed panic. They weakened the military reach and economic power of the palace states, exposing their vulnerability. This external shock then ignited the simmering internal tensions. A kingdom already struggling to feed its people and maintain control could not withstand a crisis on two fronts. The rebellion, when it came, might have been seen by some not as destruction, but as liberation from a failing order. The aftermath was a profound and haunting silence. Following the burnings, the art of writing vanished from Greece for centuries. The complex bureaucracy, the international trade, the fresco painters, and the skilled metalworkers all disappeared. What followed were the Greek Dark Ages, a period of dramatic cultural amnesia. Populations dwindled, settlements became smaller and more isolated, and memory of the palace era faded into half-remembered myth. The vibrant, interconnected world of the Mycenaeans was replaced by a simpler, fragmented one, a stark reminder that collapse is not merely about buildings falling, but about the unraveling of the very ideas that hold a civilization together. This pattern of internal fracture following external pressure brings us to the final, and most resilient, actor in this drama, the only great power that managed to survive, though forever changed. The story of the collapse has a single, glaring exception, a civilization that did not fall into the silent dark. Egypt endured. While empires crumbled to the north and west, the land of the pharaohs managed to weather the storm, but its survival came at a price so steep it forever altered the nation's destiny. Egypt's experience provides a crucial counterpoint, a case study in what it took to withstand the chaos and what was lost in the process. The pharaohs left us two stark chapters in this fight. The first came under the son of the great, the second. His victory stele, mentioned earlier, records repelling a major Libyan invasion, but it significantly notes that among the enemy were fighters from the north, peoples of the sea. This was a warning shot, a distant skirmish that hinted at the scale of trouble to come. The decisive confrontation, however, arrived a generation later under Pharaoh III. His monumental temple is our primary source, its walls screaming with propaganda. The inscriptions describe a coordinated assault on two fronts, a terrifying pincer movement by the sea peoples. They came by land and by sea, a migration-turned invasion, aiming to settle in the rich Nile Delta. The third claims a total victory. He boasts of marshaling his forces like a wall of metal, of trapping the enemy ships in the Nile's mouths and turning the river red. His artists carved scenes of absolute Egyptian triumph, of bound captives and chaotic naval battles. For a moment, it seemed the old order had held, that divine kingship had successfully defended the cosmic order from the forces of chaos. But these proud carvings tell only half the story. The real narrative of Egypt's survival is written not in stone, but in economic records and the quiet desperation of its people. Winning the war nearly bankrupted the state. Mobilizing the entire military machine for such a prolonged defense drained the royal treasuries that had been filled by centuries of prosperous trade. Trade that had now evaporated with the collapse of the international system. The gold and copper that once flowed from Canaan and Nubia slowed to a trickle. In the aftermath, the Egyptian state, though politically intact, was financially crippled. The human cost of this economic strain became shockingly clear in the village of El Medina, home to the artisans who built the royal tombs. From the ruins of this community, archaeologists recovered papyri that record a remarkable event, the first known labor strike in history. The tomb workers, the very men who carved the pharaoh's eternal resting places, put down their tools. Their reason was simple and devastating. The state had failed to deliver their monthly grain rations for several months. They marched in protest, shouting, "We are hungry." The pharaoh's government, the same institution that had just turned back an invasion of nations, could not reliably feed its own most skilled and essential workforce. This was a profound crack in the foundation. The strike was eventually resolved with partial payment, but the precedent was set and the vulnerability was exposed. The authority of the god-king was no longer absolute. It was negotiable, dependent on a functioning economy he could no longer fully control. Externally, the victory proved hollow in the long term. To secure its borders, Egypt was forced to retract. It lost its grip on its empire, gradually withdrawing from its territories in Canaan and loosening its control over Nubia to the south. The world beyond its borders was now a fragmented, dangerous place, no longer a network of friendly trading partners, but a realm of small, unstable kingdoms. Egypt saved its political core, its valley and its dynasty, but it emerged from the crisis shrunken and inward-looking. The great age of pyramid builders and imperial conquerors was over. The dynasty that followed the third was a period of accelerating decline, marked by corruption, tomb robberies, and a loss of central authority. Within a century, Egypt would slip into a period of internal division, eventually succumbing to foreign rule. So what does the Egyptian exception teach us? It shows that survival in the face of a systemic collapse is not the same as thriving. Egypt defeated the invaders on the battlefield, but it could not defeat the deeper economic and social currents the invaders had unleashed. Its successful defense required a massive expenditure of resources it could not replenish, exposing fatal weaknesses in its own administrative and economic structures. In the fractured post-collapse world, there were no quick recoveries, no easy returns to glory. Even the winner was left weakened, navigating a new and diminished reality. The story of the Sea Peoples, then, is not a simple tale of a destroyer and a survivor. It is a lesson in systemic fragility, a demonstration of how interconnected civilizations can unravel from multiple points of failure at once. And as the dust settled on the burnt palaces and the struggling kingdoms, a haunting question remained for the people who lived through the aftermath. How do you rebuild a world when the old maps no longer apply? The warriors present a fascinating paradox, a single name that appears on both sides of the conflict, blurring the line between defender and destroyer. Long before the name was etched among the enemies these fighters were a known and trusted presence within Egypt itself. Art from the time of Pharaoh II, nearly a century earlier, depicts them clearly. They are shown as elite mercenaries in the Egyptian ranks, their most striking feature being a unique helmet topped with a distinctive horn or disc, often with a central spike or knob. These were not generic infantry, they were specialized troops, likely valued for their seafaring skills or particular style of combat. They fought for the pharaoh, were paid from his treasury, and in doing so, helped uphold the very imperial order their descendants or kin would later assault. This single detail unravels a simplistic narrative. It reveals that the groups later called Sea Peoples were not a monolithic foreign horde, but were already woven into the complex fabric of the late Bronze Age world. They had a professional relationship with the great powers, a relationship built on service and reward. So what changed? Why would warriors who once served the pharaohs later sail against them? The answer lies in the fragile nature of that mercenary contract. These were professional soldiers for hire, their loyalty secured by regular pay, stable employment, and the prestige of serving a mighty empire. Their allegiance was to the contract, not to the crown. When the systemic collapse began, the terms of that contract shattered. As trade networks failed, the royal treasuries that funded their wages would have dwindled. As internal crises mounted, the pharaoh's attention and resources would have been diverted elsewhere. For a band of professional warriors, the breakdown of the system that employed them created a stark choice: fade into poverty or use their formidable skills to secure a new future by other means. The who attacked Egypt may not have been the exact same individuals who once defended it, but they came from the same cultural and professional pool. They were a symptom of the unraveling world, a group that transitioned from being a pillar of the status to a force of its destruction when that status could no longer support them. This fluidity forces us to rethink the entire conflict. It was not a clear-cut war between civilizations, but a chaotic realignment where professional armies dissolved, old alliances broke, and skilled fighters were cast adrift, becoming a threat to the very societies that once welcomed them. The story of the reminds us that in times of systemic failure, the boundaries between insider and outsider, between protector and plunderer, can vanish with terrifying speed. Their success on the battlefield was not just a matter of numbers or fury, but of a fundamental mismatch in how war was waged. The great empires of the Bronze Age had perfected a very specific kind of warfare, one built around a central, prestigious, and expensive asset, the chariot. These were not the light, speedy vehicles of later centuries, but heavy, tank-like platforms, often carrying a driver, a shield-bearer, and a noble archer or spearman. They were symbols of elite power, requiring flat, open terrain to be effective and an enormous logistical tail to maintain the horses, craftsmen, and specialized training. The entire military doctrine of kingdoms like the Hittites and Egyptians was designed to support this chariot corps, with infantry often playing a supporting role. This was a military machine optimized for set-piece battles on familiar ground, for projecting power along established roads and plains. Then came the Sea Peoples, whose entire way of fighting seemed designed to bypass this system entirely. Their most terrifying innovation was not a weapon, but a vessel. The ships depicted are strikingly different from the sleek, oared galleys of Egyptian or Aegean traders. They appear sturdier, with higher prows and deeper hulls, built not for carrying bulk cargo but for riding the open sea and landing directly on a beach. These were raiding ships, designed for sudden arrival and rapid assault. They turned the coastline, the very lifeline of the Bronze Age world, from a highway into a frontier of endless vulnerability. A fortified city like Ugarit might feel secure from a land army marching down the coast road, but it could not defend every inch of its shoreline. A fleet could appear at dawn, disgorge hundreds of warriors onto the sand, and strike before any chariots could be mobilized and deployed to the correct stretch of beach. This naval mobility granted them the ultimate tactical advantage, the initiative. They chose where and when to fight, forcing the slower, heavier imperial armies to react on terrain the invaders had selected. Once ashore, their infantry presented another stark contrast. While Egyptian reliefs show them in a mix of gear, common elements emerge: long slashing swords, round shields, and those distinctive helmets adorned with feathers or horns. This was the kit of a close-quarters fighter. The long sword was a brutal and personal weapon, effective in the press of a melee on a crowded deck or in the narrow streets of a burning town. It was fundamentally different from the thrusting spears and composite bows that were the mainstay of chariot warfare, which relied on striking from a distance. Their tactics seemed to embrace chaos and momentum, a shock assault meant to overwhelm local defenders before any organized resistance could form. The question of their inherent prowess is complex. Egyptian propaganda certainly had every reason to portray them as formidable demons of the sea, making Pharaoh's victory seem all the more glorious. Yet their repeated successes against multiple powerful states suggest something more than propaganda. It is likely they were not superhuman warriors, but highly adaptable and pragmatic fighters. They excelled at the kind of warfare the empires were worst at: asymmetric, amphibious raiding. They avoided the grand battles where chariots excelled and instead hit soft, undefended targets, supply depots, unfortified villages, and critical port infrastructure. In doing so, They did not need to destroy the main Egyptian or Hittite army in the field. They only needed to cripple the economic and logistical systems that allowed those armies to exist. A bronze workshop destroyed is 100 chariots never built. A grain shipment burned is an army that cannot campaign. Their true weapon was systemic disruption, and their military tactics were perfectly crafted to deliver it. They fought not to conquer the empire's heart, but to sever its limbs, leaving the centralized military machine paralyzed, bleeding, and ultimately unable to sustain the society it was built to protect. This mismatch between an old, rigid way of war and a new, fluid threat reveals a timeless truth that technological and tactical innovation often matters most when it exploits an opponent's greatest point of pride, turning their very strength into a fatal weakness. The most enduring legacy of this chaotic period is not found in ruins, but in a new society taking root. While the great empires fell, one group from the Confederation carved out a permanent home, transforming from invaders into neighbors and eventually into legends. In the southern coastal plain of Canaan, archaeology reveals the clear footprint of the people the Egyptians called the ones we know as the Philistines. They did not just raid this territory, they settled it, establishing a powerful network known as the Philistine, a league of 5 major cities, and became their new centers of power, strategically positioned along the coast and inland trade routes. This was not a temporary camp. It was a deliberate and successful colonization, a statement that they had arrived to stay. The proof is in the pottery. In the layers of earth dating immediately after the collapse, at sites like, and archaeologists uncover a dramatic cultural shift. The local Canaanite pottery styles are abruptly joined by something entirely new, a type scholars call Mycenaean IIIC. This pottery has a very specific pedigree. Its shapes and decorative motifs, like spirals and stylized birds, are directly descended from the ceramic traditions of the Aegean world, the same world of the fallen Mycenaean palaces. These were not imported luxury items, they were everyday bowls, jugs, and storage jars. This means the potters themselves, likely women who carried this knowledge across the sea, were now making a home in Canaan. Over the next century, this style evolved, blending with local influences to create a unique and vibrant Philistine bichrome ware decorated in red and black. This ceramic evolution is a perfect metaphor for their story, a distinct foreign identity slowly weaving itself into the local fabric. Their cultural distinctiveness extended even to the dinner table. Analysis of animal bones from Philistine sites shows a sudden and sharp increase in the consumption of pork compared to earlier Canaanite layers. While their Canaanite and later Israelite neighbors largely avoided pig husbandry, the Philistines embraced it. This dietary difference, preserved in ancient trash heaps, is a powerful marker of ethnic identity, a stubborn culinary tradition that survived the long journey from their Aegean homeland. Together, the pottery and the pig bones form archaeology's strongest case for a true migration, not merely a military campaign. These were not just soldiers, but families bringing their recipes, their crafts, and their way of life to a new land. Centuries later, their story would be framed through a very different lens, immortalized in the biblical narratives of their rivals. The Philistines became the archetypal adversaries in the Hebrew Bible, a powerful coastal people constantly clashing with the Israelites. Their most famous champion was a giant named Goliath, felled by the future King David with a single stone. In these texts, they are as uncircumcised foes, a theological and political other. Yet this very portrayal acknowledges their profound and permanent impact. They were no longer a fleeting terror from the sea, but an established kingdom, a fixture in the complex ethnic tapestry of the region for centuries. Their journey from being listed among the destroyers of a world to becoming key players in the foundation of a new one is perhaps the ultimate lesson of the Sea Peoples. It shows that out of the collapse's ashes, new identities were forged, and that even those labeled as agents of chaos could become builders of a lasting legacy. Centuries after the last palace burned, a new kind of memory began to take shape, not in clay or stone, but in song and story. The Greeks of the so-called Dark Ages and the following Archaic period did not possess history books, but they held onto a powerful oral tradition. A tapestry of epic poetry that reached its zenith with the works attributed to Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey. These are not chronicles, but they are not pure fantasy either. They are set in a shimmering, half-remembered past, a mythologized version of the very late Bronze Age world that had collapsed into ruins. Within these tales of godlike heroes and divine whims, scholars listen for distant echoes of the real trauma that reshaped the Mediterranean. The Trojan War itself, the decade-long siege of a wealthy Anatolian city by a coalition of Greek kings, mirrors the scale and coalition-style warfare of the Bronze Age international system. Homer's famous catalogue of ships, a meticulous listing of the Greek contingents and their homelands, reads less like a poet's invention and more like a distorted administrative record. A ghostly echo of the linear B tablets that once tallied men and materials for real campaigns. The epic world is one of wandering, of the fraught journey home. Odysseus spends 10 years lost, battling monsters and navigating a shattered landscape of fallen cities and forgotten peoples. This profound theme of displacement, of heroes struggling to find their place in a changed world, resonates deeply with the archaeological evidence of widespread migration and societal fragmentation. Could the Cyclops, the Lotus Eaters, and the Sirens be poetic metaphors for the very real dangers and cultural disorientation faced by refugees and sailors in the tumultuous post-collapse era? The palaces Homer describes, like the splendid halls of King, gleam with a Bronze Age opulence of bronze, gold, and fine craftsmanship that had vanished from Greece for generations. This suggests the poets were weaving threads of a genuine cultural memory, a hazy recollection of a lost age of grandeur that stood in stark contrast to the simpler, harder world of their own time. Most telling of all is the central, recurring motif of the sacked city. The Iliad is, at its heart, the story of a great city's destruction. The Odyssey begins with the aftermath of that war, with heroes scattered and kingdoms in disarray. This is not a celebration of victory, but a profound meditation on loss, on the human cost of cataclysm. The vivid descriptions of falling towers, of families torn apart, and of a glorious past forever lost, may well be the cultural sediment of a collective trauma. The story of the collapse told and retold over centuries, until the historical facts blurred into archetypal myth. Homer gives a name and a face to the chaos, not as a faceless horde from the sea, but as the anger of Achilles, the cunning of Odysseus, and the doomed nobility of Hector. In doing so, he transformed a historical catastrophe into a foundational story about the human condition, ensuring that the echo of those fallen palaces would never fully fade from memory. But this raises a profound question about historical storytelling itself. Are we certain we have identified the true villain of this ancient tale? For all the vivid carvings and dramatic destruction layers, a growing chorus of scholars urges caution. They propose a startling reversal, that the Sea Peoples were not the cause of the collapse, but one of its most visible symptoms. Imagine a doctor focusing only on the fever, while missing the underlying infection ravaging the body. In this alternative view, the fever is the raids, but the infection is something far more systemic. One compelling theory suggests the Egyptians themselves created the monster they fought. The term Sea Peoples might not describe a unified ethnic group or a coordinated army at all. Instead, it could be a convenient label, a propaganda tool used by Pharaoh III to explain a crisis that was far more complex. In the face of unexplained chaos from the north, branding a diverse collection of pirates, mercenaries, and desperate migrants as a single demonic enemy served a powerful political purpose. It a messy reality into a story of heroic defense, allowing the pharaoh to position himself as the sole defender of cosmic order against a foreign chaos he could name and claim to have defeated. The people depicted might have been just that, a disparate mix of groups already adrift in a disintegrating world, their unity existing only in the eyes of their terrified and triumphant opponents. They were not an external invading force so much as a symbol of the internal unraveling happening everywhere. An even broader perspective looks past people entirely and focuses on the system itself. This is the system's collapse theory. It argues that the highly specialized, interconnected global economy of the late Bronze Age was like a vast and delicate machine. Every part relied on every other part. When multiple stresses converged, the entire machine seized up. The primary triggers were likely environmental, the prolonged droughts revealed by tree rings and ice cores. Crop failures led to famine. Famine led to migrations and social unrest, which in turn disrupted the trade routes that were the empire's lifeblood. Kings could no longer pay their armies or feed their people, leading to a loss of faith in the entire political and religious order. In this scenario, the Sea Peoples appear not as the hunters who brought down the great beasts, but as scavengers and opportunists. They were the ones moving into the power vacuums, attacking cities that were already starving, isolated, and politically fractured. Their raids were the final, violent spasms of a body already in its death throes, not the mortal wound itself. This debate is not merely academic, it strikes at the heart of how we understand catastrophe. Do we blame external invaders, a clear and satisfying enemy? Or do we look inward, at the inherent fragilities within a society, the silent vulnerabilities that make it susceptible to a changing climate or a broken trade route? The story of the Sea Peoples, therefore, transforms from a simple adventure of warriors and kings into a timeless parable about interdependence and resilience. It asks us to consider whether the greatest threat to any civilization ultimately comes from beyond its walls, or from the invisible cracks in its own foundation. Among the ashes of Ugarit, a single clay tablet holds a voice frozen in its final moment. This is not a royal chronicle or a tax record, but a desperate letter, baked hard by the inferno that consumed the city, preserving its plea for all time. The king of Ugarit, a man named, was writing a reply to the king of the island we know as Cyprus. The Cypriot ruler had apparently written first, sounding an alarm about enemy ships approaching the coast. Response is a masterpiece of helplessness. He explains that his own army and chariots are far away, on campaign in Hittite lands. Then he delivers the devastating detail. His entire fleet, his city's first and last line of maritime defense, is not in port. He writes that his ships are actually stationed in the land of. This is a chilling admission. There were a people from southwestern Anatolia, often listed among the groups later called the Sea Peoples. So Ugarit's navy was, incredibly, posted in the very territory from which some of the attackers may have originated, either as a defensive gesture or as part of some failed alliance. It was a catastrophic miscalculation that left the city utterly exposed. The letter's closing lines are stark. The enemy ships are already here, writes. They have set fire to my towns and done very great damage." The words are calm, almost formal, belying the terror they convey. This is not a report from the early stages of a siege. It is a message sent when the end had already begun. The fires he mentions were likely visible from his palace window. This tablet is our most intimate window into the mechanics of the collapse. It shows us that the rulers of the age were not ignorant of the threat. They were communicating, they were aware. The network of royal correspondence, that great achievement of the Bronze Age, was still functioning. Letters were being sent on clay tablets from Cyprus to Syria, from Anatolia to Egypt. But the system had become a cruel joke, a mechanism for sharing panic rather than mustering aid. Knew he was in trouble, and the king of Cyprus knew he was in trouble, but the old bonds of mutual defense, the treaties and alliances, were now just words on clay. The practical means to help one another, the armies, the ships, the secure supply lines had all evaporated. The letter was never sent. Archaeologists found it in the oven of a scribe's house, left behind in the frantic final moments, perhaps because the messenger never made it to the docks, or because the docks were already in flames. It was placed in the kiln of history not by a scribe's hand, but by the disaster itself. This single artifact transforms the collapse from an archaeological abstraction into a human tragedy. We hear the voice of a king who could see the wave coming but had nowhere to run, a leader watching the very tools of his power, his ships and soldiers, rendered useless by distance and bad timing. His words embody the paralyzing truth of systemic failure, when every part of a system is aware of the crisis, but the connections between those parts have already been severed, leaving each node isolated. Waiting for a help that can no longer arrive. The world did not end with the burning of the palaces, but it was irrevocably reborn. In the silence that followed the Great Collapse, a profound transformation began, one driven not by kings, but by scarcity and necessity. The intricate international system that had supplied the essential tin for bronze was gone, leaving a technological vacuum. Into this void stepped a new metal, iron. Once a closely guarded secret of the Hittite elite, ironworking technology now diffused rapidly across the fractured landscape. The reason was simple and powerful. Iron ore is far more common than the rare tin required for bronze. It was a democratizing force. You did not need access to a vast royal trade network to forge an iron plowshare or a sword. You needed only local deposits and the knowledge to smelt it. This shift from bronze to iron was more than a change in material. It was a decentralization of power. The ability to make effective tools and weapons moved out of the exclusive palace workshops and into smaller, local forges, empowering communities that had once been wholly dependent on the central authority. The collapse of the old order had, paradoxically, unlocked a more accessible and resilient technological age. Political power underwent a similar fragmentation and renewal. The monolithic, palace-centered empires were replaced by a vibrant mosaic of smaller, more adaptable units. Along the coast of the Levant, the Phoenician city-states like Tyre and Sidon rose from the ashes of older Canaanite ports. Unburdened by vast inland territories to administer, they turned their gaze entirely seaward, becoming the master navigators and traders of the new age. They rebuilt the shattered trade networks, not as imperial subjects, but as agile, independent merchants, eventually spreading their alphabet across the Mediterranean. Inland, tribal confederations and new kingdoms took shape, like the Aramaean states in Syria. And in the central hill country of Canaan, a different kind of community was coalescing, one defined not by a king in a palace, but by a shared covenant and tribal identity, the early Israelites. These were societies built on different principles, often more localized, more resilient to single points of failure, and more experimental in their forms of governance. This period following the collapse has often been called a Dark Age, and in terms of lost literacy and monumental architecture, it was. But to see only the dimming of an old light is to miss the new sparks being struck in the gloom. This was an era of ferocious creativity born from necessity. Without the overwhelming shadow of great empires, local cultures could experiment, adapt, and innovate. The alphabetic script developed by the Phoenicians, for instance, was a revolutionary democratization of writing, far easier to learn than the complex syllabic systems of the Bronze Age. This fragmentation created the conditions for diverse political and religious ideas to take root and compete. The classical world of the Greeks, with its independent city-states, the maritime empire of the Phoenicians, and the monotheistic tradition of the Hebrews. None of these would have emerged in their distinctive forms under the homogenizing pressure of the Hittite or Egyptian superpowers. They needed the space that the collapse provided. So the chaos attributed to the Sea Peoples, while devastating, served as a brutal but effective reset. It cleared the ground, however violently, for new seeds to grow. The old system was too rigid, too interconnected, and too unequal to reform itself from within. Its catastrophic failure created the opportunity for a technological revolution in iron and a political revolution in scale and organization. This is the ultimate, unsettling lesson of the late Bronze Age collapse, that destruction and creation are often two sides of the same historical coin. The end of one world is the painful, necessary precondition for the beginning of the next, reminding us that resilience is not about avoiding collapse, but about what we manage to build from the pieces left behind. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is not just a relic of the distant past, it is a mirror reflecting our own world. We live in an era of astonishing interconnection, a global network of trade, finance, and information that moves with a speed and scale the ancient kings could never have dreamed of. Yet this very strength echoes the fundamental vulnerability of the late Bronze Age system. Our prosperity, too, is built on a delicate web of dependencies, where a disruption in one corner of the world can send shockwaves through every other. Consider a single container ship stuck in a canal and suddenly store shelves on another continent grow bare. A conflict in a major grain-producing region sends food prices soaring globally. A health crisis in one city can, within weeks, become a worldwide challenge. These are not hypotheticals, they are the lived experience of our century, demonstrating how a shock to one critical node can ripple through the entire structure with breathtaking speed. The ancient empires discovered that their greatest achievement, their intricate international system, became their greatest point of failure when the threads began to snap. Our modern global system faces a similar paradox. The efficiency that delivers incredible wealth is often achieved by minimizing redundancy, by creating just-in-time supply chains and highly specialized production hubs. This is brilliant for cost and speed, but it leaves little room for error when something goes wrong. When the ships stopped sailing in the 12th century before the Common Era, the palace workshops fell silent for lack of materials. Today, a similar rupture in the flow of essential components can idle factories halfway around the world, reminding us that complexity, without resilience, is a fragile kind of strength. The climate pressures that likely pushed populations to migrate then are also a pressing reality now. While our ancestors faced prolonged drought, we confront a changing climate that threatens agricultural patterns, water supplies, and the habitability of coastal regions, potentially displacing populations on a scale that would make the ancient migration seem modest. The emergence of the sea peoples, whether as cause or symptom, highlights another timeless lesson, that when large systems falter, unpredictable and powerful forces can arise from the margins. These are not always invading armies. They can be economic shifts, political movements, or technological disruptions that the old order is too rigid to comprehend or absorb. So what does this ancient collapse teach us about building a more resilient future? It suggests that survival may depend less on building higher walls and more on fostering flexibility. It calls for building redundancy into our critical systems, so that if one path is blocked, others exist. It emphasizes the need for societies to be adaptable, to have the capacity to pivot when familiar solutions no longer work. The civilizations that ultimately emerged from the Bronze Age Dark Age were not copies of what came before. They were something new, forged in the crucible of necessity. They learned in the hardest way possible that no civilization is impervious. Their story is not a prophecy of doom, but a sobering reminder from the depths of time. It asks us to look at the invisible architecture of our own world, to consider its points of stress, and to remember that the ultimate test of any system is not how it functions in calm seas, but how it weathers the sudden storm. The evidence for this ancient catastrophe is not found in a single book, but in 1,000 scattered fragments, each requiring a different kind of eye to see its story. To reconstruct the narrative of the sea peoples, we must become detectives of dust and clay, learning the languages of the earth itself. The most fundamental tool is stratigraphy, the simple but profound principle that in an undisturbed site, deeper layers are older. When an archaeologist carefully excavates a mound, they are reading a book written in soil, ash, and stone. A dark, compacted layer full of charcoal and collapsed is a chapter of violent ending. By studying the styles of pottery sealed within that layer and comparing them to sequences from other sites, experts can date that destruction event with remarkable precision, often to within a few decades. This is how we know that the burning of Ugarit, the fall of, and the sacking of Mycenaean palaces all cluster around the same pivotal period, painting a map of near-simultaneous collapse. But pottery tells more than just time, it tells journeys. This is where petrographic analysis comes in. Scientists take a thin slice of a ceramic shard, a piece of a broken pot, and examine it under a microscope. They are not looking at its shape or decoration, but at the very fabric of the clay itself, the tiny mineral inclusions within it. These minerals are a geological fingerprint, pointing directly to the specific region where the clay was dug from the ground. When this technique is applied to the distinct Philistine pottery found in Canaan, the analysis can confirm whether the clay is local or if it matches the geology of the Aegean world, providing physical proof for a theory of long-distance migration. It turns a broken piece of domestic ware into a passport stamped with the story of an ancient voyage. The written word from this era is often cryptic and always damaged. This is the realm of a specialist who works like a linguistic surgeon on ancient texts. Their canvas might be a clay tablet cracked into a dozen pieces, a stone stele eroded by weather, or a papyrus scroll so brittle it threatens to crumble at a touch. Their task is to reassemble, clean, and decipher. They must know the grammar and vocabulary of long-dead languages like Akkadian, the diplomatic tongue of the age, or Linear B, the administrative script of the Mycenaeans. They confront puzzles where key lines are missing, where foreign names are spelled phonetically in a different writing system, creating endless debate. Is the Egyptian the same as the mentioned in a Hittite text? This careful comparison of these scattered references is what builds the tentative roster of the sea peoples, transforming a list of enemy names on a temple wall into a historical clue. Some of the most tantalizing evidence, however, lies beneath the waves. Underwater archaeology has begun to probe this turbulent period, searching for the shipwrecks that must dot the Mediterranean floor. Finding a vessel from the late 13th century, before the Common Era, would be a treasure trove beyond gold. Its hull construction would reveal shipbuilding techniques, telling us what these raiding or migrant ships were truly capable of. Its cargo, whether it held ingots of copper and tin, fine pottery, or personal belongings, would provide a frozen snapshot of what was moving across the seas in the final days of the Bronze Age. Or what people carried with them as they fled. A single preserved wreck could answer questions that decades of digging on land have only partially addressed. No single discipline holds the full picture. The modern understanding of the collapse is a tapestry woven from many threads. Climatologists analyze ice cores from Greenland and tree rings from ancient Anatolian junipers, reading the history of drought and temperature in bands of ice and wood. Sift through ancient seeds and pollen to understand agricultural practices and crop failures. Philologists compare the mythic cycles of Homer with the administrative records of Linear B, looking for echoes of real events. This interdisciplinary conversation is what transforms the sea peoples from a shadowy mystery into a comprehensible, though still fiercely debated, historical phenomenon. It reminds us that history is not a collection of settled facts, but an ongoing investigation. The narrative we have followed is built from the painstaking work of scholars who spend lifetimes piecing together stories from a sliver of inscribed bone, a peculiar layer of ash, or a unique chemical signature in a piece of pottery. They are detectives of the deep past, and their most important discovery may be this, that even the most world-ending events leave traces, waiting for us to learn how to read them. That intricate web of trade had a parallel system, a diplomatic network just as vital and just as fragile. For generations, the great kings did not rule in isolation, they spoke to one another as brothers. A remarkable archive discovered in Egypt, known as the Letters, preserves this lost language of power. Written about a century before the collapse, these clay tablets are the royal emails of the Bronze Age, sent between the pharaohs of Egypt and their counterparts in Babylon, Assyria, and the Hittite Empire. They are composed not in Egyptian hieroglyphs or Hittite cuneiform, but in the diplomatic lingua franca of the time, the Akkadian language of Mesopotamia. The tone is one of elaborate, calculated courtesy. Kings address each other as "my brother," exchanging lavish gifts of gold, ivory, lapis lazuli, and finely crafted furniture. They negotiate marriages, sending royal daughters to foreign courts to cement alliances that were both personal and geopolitical. This was more than mere politeness. It was a sophisticated system of checks and balances, a brotherhood of kings that maintained a precarious peace across thousands of miles. A stable Hittite border meant Egypt could focus its energies elsewhere, and a friendly Egypt ensured Babylonian trade routes remained open. The entire international order relied on this constant, careful dialogue. The sudden and total disappearance of the Hittite Empire shattered this system at its core. Imagine a global conference call where one of the main speakers suddenly goes silent, their line going dead without explanation. For the kings of Babylon and Assyria, the silence would have been deafening and terrifying. A major pillar of the geopolitical landscape had simply vanished. The trusted channels of communication, the scribes who translated Akkadian, the diplomats who knew the protocols, the roads safe for messengers, all of it began to disintegrate. The elegant language of brotherhood and gift exchange had no vocabulary for what was happening. It could not describe the scorched earth, the fleeing populations, or the fleets of unknown attackers. So the correspondence that did manage to get through in those final decades changed tone completely. We move from the polished phrases of the letters to the raw, desperate plea found in the ashes of Ugarit. That final letter to the king of Cyprus is not diplomacy, it is a cry for help from a drowning man. The old rules of the Brotherhood had broken down, leaving only a stark alert about enemy ships and burning towns. The end of this international dialogue marked a profound cultural regression. The cosmopolitan world where an Egyptian pharaoh might quote Babylonian proverbs, or a Hittite king would dress in Egyptian linen, simply ceased to exist. The shared language of Akkadian faded from administrative use in the West. The wide horizons of the Bronze Age kings contracted into local concerns, survival, and defense. The idea that a ruler's peers lived in distant capitals, that one's interests were intertwined with the stability of a whole system, was lost for centuries. The political collapse carried with it an immense cultural cost, the death of a truly international perspective, a narrowing of the world that would take generations to heal. The most enduring myths are often born from the deepest traumas. Centuries after the last palace fell, a philosopher in classical Greece would tell a story of a different kind of catastrophe, one that has haunted the human imagination ever since. In his dialogues, Plato described a magnificent island empire called Atlantis, a hub of immense power and advanced culture that grew arrogant, the gods, and was punished in a single day and night. Swallowed whole by the sea, the tale was presented as a moral fable, a warning about hubris and the fragility of even the greatest civilizations. While scholars widely agree Plato invented Atlantis as a philosophical device, its origins remain a tantalizing mystery. Could the seed of this story have been planted by the real-world collapse of the late Bronze Age, a cataclysm so vast it echoed through folklore for 1,000 years before finding new form? The connection is speculative, yet powerfully resonant. Imagine the fragmented memories passed down over generations by survivors and their descendants. Stories of great cities with towering walls, of kings who commanded the sea, all brought low by fire and wave. In the oral traditions of sailors and migrants, these memories could have blurred and merged, transforming from history into archetype. The image of a proud civilization vanishing beneath the waves is a potent metaphor, and the era of the Sea Peoples provides a plausible historical canvas for such a metaphor to be painted. One specific event often pulled into this speculative web is the earlier eruption of the volcano on Thera, which devastated the Minoan civilization on Crete around 1600 years before the Common Era. That was a single, apocalyptic natural disaster that literally sank part of an island and crippled a major maritime culture. Its memory, carried by refugees and traders, could have woven itself into the broader tapestry of later collapses. By the time of Plato, the Greek world was surrounded by the silent, overgrown ruins of the Mycenaean age, colossal stone walls they called Cyclopean, believing only giants could have built them. These physical remnants of a lost golden age, coupled with ancestral stories of a great flood or a war that toppled kingdoms, provided fertile ground for a philosopher's imagination. The academic consensus is clear: Atlantis is not a historical place waiting to be found on a map. But the power of the Atlantis legend lies not in its geography, but in its psychology. It gives shape to our deepest anxiety about societal fragility, the fear that everything we build can be undone in an instant. The late Bronze Age collapse is perhaps history's most dramatic example of that fear realized. A sophisticated, interconnected world did vanish with shocking speed, its cities left in ashes and its languages forgotten. That real event is, in many ways, more compelling than any myth. It proves that civilizations are not immortal, that complexity carries inherent risk, and that the sea can bring both connection and catastrophe. The speculative link between the Sea Peoples and Atlantis, therefore, is less about proving a historical fact and more about understanding how history becomes story. It shows how the raw, terrifying experience of systemic failure can be distilled over centuries into a powerful narrative about pride and punishment, about the ocean that gives and the ocean that takes. The real Atlantis may not lie at the bottom of the Atlantic, but its ghost lingers in the stratified ash of, in the sunken anchors off the coast of Ugarit, and in the haunting question of how we remember a world that left no survivors to tell its own tale. The names carved at are a cryptic list, a roster of enemies that has echoed for. But what if these names are more than just labels? What if they are linguistic fossils, preserving the faintest echo of lost languages and forgotten homelands? This is where the investigation moves from the ash of ruins to the sounds of ancient speech, a detective story built on syllables and consonants. Scholars have long played a high-stakes game of phonetic matching, trying to connect these Egyptian spellings to known places and peoples from later maps. They, for instance, bear a striking resemblance to Lycia, a region in southwestern Anatolia that Hittite records mention as sometimes rebellious. The sounds tantalizingly close to Sicily, and they could connect to the Homer's name for the Greeks, or even to the Israelite tribe of Dan mentioned in later biblical texts. On the surface, it seems like a clear trail, as if the Egyptian scribes were giving us a phonetic travelogue of the invaders' origins. Yet this path is fraught with pitfalls. The ancient Egyptian writing system did not record vowels with precision, so what we read as is a modern guess at a series of consonant sounds. Different scholars can propose wildly different original pronunciations from the same hieroglyphs. A phonetic similarity across centuries and languages can be a mirage, a coincidence of sound without any historical connection. It is like hearing a word in a foreign language that sounds like a word in your own, and assuming they mean the same thing, when in reality they are entirely separate. Furthermore, these are names given by outsiders. The Egyptians were not asking these groups what they called themselves. They were creating a label for a foreign threat. Those labels could be based on a place of origin, a leader's name, a physical characteristic, or even a derogatory term. We simply do not know the rules of the naming game they were playing. The most profound silence in this entire saga is the absence of the Sea People's own voice. We have no inscription, no tablet, no graffito that we can confidently say was written by a in their native tongue. They left no deciphered written language of their own. This means we are trying to reconstruct their identity solely through the words of their enemies, a one-sided conversation where we only hear the questions, never the answers. This linguistic black hole forces a humbling realization. For all our archaeological science and historical cross-referencing, we may never know what these people called themselves, what stories they told, or what songs they sang on their long voyages. Their true names and the rich worlds those names represented may be lost forever, swallowed not by the sea, but by the silence of unwritten history. Silence is not an emptiness, it is an invitation. In the great quiet that followed the burning of the imperial palaces, the political map of the Near East did not stay blank for long. The vacuum left by the Hittite collapse and the Egyptian retreat was not a void, but a space, a sudden opening on the stage of history. Into this space stepped new actors, not with the heavy tread of imperial armies, but with the shrewd calculation of merchants and the adaptable spirit of migrants. Two groups in particular rose to reshape the post-collapse world, one mastering the sea, the other mastering the land, and both proving that the end of an age can be the beginning of unparalleled opportunity. Along the thin, fertile strip of the Levantan coast, cities that had once paid tribute to pharaohs or Hittite kings found themselves suddenly independent. Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre were not new settlements. They were ancient ports with deep roots, but they had always lived in the shadow of greater powers, their fates dictated by distant emperors. Now, with those emperors gone, they were free. Unburdened by the need to administer vast inland territories or maintain colossal standing armies, these Phoenician city-states turned their gaze entirely outward, to the open water. They became something the Bronze Age had never truly seen, a civilization built not on conquest but on commerce. Their genius was maritime. They took the shattered pieces of the old trade networks and reassembled them into something far more agile and far-reaching. Using ships built from the famed cedars of Lebanon, sturdier and more seaworthy than anything that had come before, they became the master navigators of the Mediterranean. They established trading posts and colonies from Cyprus to Sicily, from North Africa to the coast of Spain. Some evidence even suggests their daring voyages pushed beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, venturing into the stormy Atlantic. They traded in purple dye, a color so rare and costly it became synonymous with royalty, in glass, in fine timber, and in metals. But their most lasting export was an idea, the alphabet. In a world that had forgotten the complex syllabic scripts of the Bronze Age, the Phoenicians developed a simple system of around 24 characters representing consonant sounds. It was a revolutionary tool of efficiency, perfect for recording contracts and cargo manifests, and it would become the ancestor of nearly every major writing system in the Western world, including our own. Inland, away from the salt air, a different power was coalescing in the regions of modern-day Syria and northern Mesopotamia. These were the Aramaeans, semi-nomadic groups who had likely been present on the fringes of the Hittite and Assyrian empires for generations. The collapse of centralized authority gave them their chance. They moved into abandoned towns and established their own fortified centers, like Damascus, which would grow into one of the world's oldest continuously inhabited cities. The Aramaean kingdoms, such as Damascus and Bit, became major political and military forces, often clashing with the rising power of Assyria. But their true, enduring influence was not in their swords, but in their speech. As their merchants and diplomats traveled, their language, Aramaic, began to spread. It was easier to learn than Akkadian, the old diplomatic tongue, and it was written in a script adapted from the Phoenician alphabet. In the centuries following the collapse, Aramaic did not just become a language of trade, it became the new lingua franca, the common tongue of empires from Persia to the borders of Egypt. It was the language of administration, of diplomacy, and even of everyday life for millions. Centuries later, it would be the vernacular language of, at the time of historical figures, central to multiple faith traditions. This dramatic shift in the centers of power was no accident of history. It was a direct and profound consequence of the collapse. The Sea Peoples, whether as invaders or as symptoms, dismantled the old, top-heavy imperial order. In doing so, they inadvertently cleared the ground and broke the monopolies. They destroyed the system that had kept the Phoenician cities as vassals and had kept the Aramaeans on the margins. The new world that emerged was one of smaller, more nimble states, where success was measured less in territorial conquest and more in economic reach and cultural influence. The Phoenicians thrived because the sea lanes were open for anyone bold enough to sail them, free from the control of a single imperial navy. The Aramaeans flourished because the old linguistic hierarchy had collapsed, creating a need for a new common tongue. The chaos of the 12th century before the Common Era did not lead to a permanent Dark Age. It led to a ferocious and creative reorganization. It proved that from the ashes of a fallen system, new forms of brilliance can rise, forms that are often more adaptable, more innovative, and in their own way more enduring than the giants they replaced. But the fires of collapse may not have burned only on Mediterranean shores. To truly grasp the scale of the catastrophe, we must pull back the lens until the entire planet comes into view. What we find is a startling pattern, a series of synchronized failures across the ancient world, suggesting the crisis was far larger than the story of any single sea-raiding confederation. In the fertile valleys of China, the mighty Shang dynasty, renowned for its bronze mastery and oracle bone inscriptions, came to a violent end around the very same time. Roughly 1240 to 1046 years before the Common Era, the archaeological record shows the last Shang capital at Yin was sacked and burned, its royal tombs looted, giving way to the new Zhou dynasty. Half a world away, in the Indus Valley, the already fragmented remnants of the great civilization, which had declined centuries earlier, saw their final urban centers fade away entirely, leaving the region sparsely populated. Meanwhile, in Europe, beyond the Alps, there is evidence of significant population movements and cultural shifts, with new groups appearing and old settlements being abandoned. These events are separated by vast continents and distinct cultures, with no evidence of direct contact or communication between them. They could be mere coincidence, isolated regional troubles with their own local causes. Yet, the eerie synchronicity is too compelling to ignore. It points toward a common, global trigger, one that operated on a scale beyond human politics or warfare. This brings us to a profound concept identified by modern science, the 3.2 event. This is not a single catastrophe, but a prolonged period of severe and widespread climate instability that gripped the planet from roughly 1200 to 1100 years before the Common Era. Data from ice cores in Greenland, sediment layers in lakes, and ancient tree rings from Ireland to Anatolia all tell the same story, a dramatic shift toward colder, drier conditions. Monsoon patterns in Asia faltered, glaciers advanced, and prolonged drought became the new normal across many key regions of early civilization. Imagine a planet-wide stress test. Societies that had flourished in stable, predictable climates were suddenly thrust into a centuries-long fight for survival. In this light, the story of the Sea Peoples transforms. They were not a unique, world-ending anomaly, but the Mediterranean's specific and dramatic response to a planetary emergency. The drought in Anatolia and the Aegean could have pushed populations toward the sea and southward into the fertile Nile Delta. The same that strained Hittite grain supplies may have destabilized nomadic groups on the Eurasian steppe, setting off chain reactions of migration that eventually lapped against the walls of distant empires. The simultaneous collapse of the Shang dynasty, for instance, is closely linked by scholars to a major shift in the course of the Yellow River and a period of pronounced climatic cooling that devastated northern Chinese agriculture, leading to internal rebellion and invasion. We are not looking at a single mystery, but at a mosaic of local disasters, each colored by its own culture and geography, yet all framed by the same deteriorating global climate. This macro-historical perspective does not diminish the human drama of the Bronze Age collapse, it deepens it. It places the warriors on the ox carts and the pharaohs on their thrones within a vast, unfolding planetary narrative. Their struggles were part of a crisis centuries, a painful period where human societies across the globe, independently and yet simultaneously, faced the ultimate test of their resilience. The varying outcomes are a stark lesson. Some, like the New Kingdom of Egypt, survived but were forever weakened. Others, like the Hittites, vanished completely. New powers, like the Phoenicians and Aramaeans, emerged from the chaos. This global view suggests that the fate of civilizations may hinge less on the strength of their armies, and more on their ability to adapt when the very environment that nurtured them suddenly turns hostile. The Sea Peoples become a single thread in a much larger tapestry, a reminder that sometimes history's greatest turning points are written not in royal decrees, but in the silent, shifting patterns of the sky and the earth. The clash of empires is often a contest of tools. To understand how the Sea Peoples could challenge the greatest armies of the age, we must look closely at what they carried into battle, a story told in stone and metal. The chaotic reliefs are more than propaganda, they are a detailed catalog of military technology, frozen in the moment of conflict. Here, the differences are stark and revealing. The Egyptian forces are a picture of organized, traditional warfare. We see the elite chariot corps, the mobile archery platforms that were the pride of any pharaoh, manned by nobles wielding powerful composite bows. The infantry are often shown with the distinctive, a curved slashing sword that evolved from the axe, effective from a chariot or in an open formation. Their shields are large, covering much of the body, and they fight in disciplined ranks. Now, look at their opponents. The Sea Peoples are depicted with a very different arsenal. Many wield long, straight swords, designed for thrusting and stabbing. These are not the slashing weapons of a chariot-born aristocrat, but the tools of an infantryman who expects to fight hand-to-hand. They carry small, round shields, easy to maneuver in a tight press of bodies, sometimes decorated with spiral patterns. Some figures appear to wear a type of corselet, perhaps made of leather or linen stiffened with bronze scales, suggesting a degree of personal armor. Their helmets are perhaps their most iconic feature, often topped with crests of feathers or horns, a design that may have served for identification and intimidation as much as protection. This is not the gear of a ceremonial guard, but the practical kit of a professional fighter. The tactical implications of this equipment mismatch are profound. The Egyptian military machine, like that of the Hittites, was built for a specific kind of war. It excelled in set-piece battles on open ground, where chariots could charge and archers could loose volleys from a distance. Its strength was projection of power and shock from a mobile platform. The Sea Peoples' gear, however, suggests a doctrine built for a different kind of violence. The long thrusting sword is devastating in the crush of a melee, on the deck of a rocking ship, or in the narrow, smoky streets of a burning port city. The small shield allows for aggressive, individual movement, perfect for a warrior storming a beach or fighting through a breached gate. Their entire panoply seems optimized for close-quarters assault, for the sudden, violent raid rather than the prolonged campaign. This forensic analysis suggests their success was not merely a matter of ferocity, but of a calculated mismatch. They did not try to beat the empires at their own game. They changed the game entirely. By attacking coastal settlements and ports, they forced fights in environments where the mighty chariot was useless, a cumbersome liability on a crowded dock or a sandy beach. They turned the battle into a series of brutal, intimate brawls, where their longer reach and stabbing swords could dominate the shorter range. Their innovation was not in having better technology, but in having the right technology for the specific, brutal task of breaking into a city and overwhelming its defenders before any organized relief could arrive. This examination of iconography reveals a timeless truth in military history. The advantage does not always go to the side with the most resources or the most sophisticated tradition. Sometimes it goes to the force whose tools and tactics are perfectly adapted to exploit a specific, critical vulnerability. The Sea Peoples may have seemed less civilized to the scribes carving their defeat, but their understanding of practical, infantry-centered warfare gave them a razor's edge in the chaos they helped to create. The true terror of the open water was not a storm, but a sail on the horizon where none should be. While empires clashed on land, a quieter, more insidious war was being waged across the trade routes that fed them. The Sea Peoples mastered a form of conflict far more devastating than any single battle. They became pirates on an industrial scale, waging economic warfare against the very idea of an interconnected world. Their target was not just the cargo, but the confidence that allowed the cargo to move at all. Imagine the quintessential vessel of the late Bronze Age, a broad-beamed merchant ship, its hold packed with ingots of copper and tin, sacks of grain, amphorae of olive oil, and luxury goods from distant courts. It was slow, heavy, and utterly defenseless, a fat prize drifting along predictable coastal routes. For a fleet of agile raiding ships, crewed by fighters armed for close-quarters combat, such a merchantman was not a challenge, it was an opportunity. A single successful interception meant more than plunder. It meant a shipment of vital bronze components would never reach the palace workshop. A delivery of emergency grain would never relieve a hungry city. Each captured ship was a tiny hemorrhage in the economic body of the empire, but the real damage was psychological. Word would spread from port to port. The sea lanes were no longer safe. The unthinkable had happened. The predictable rhythms of commerce, the foundation of royal power and international stability, could not be guaranteed. When the risk outweighs the reward, trade simply stops. Merchants, the lifeblood of the system, would refuse to sail. Insurance, in its most basic ancient form, the calculation of risk, became impossible. This was asymmetric warfare of the most effective kind. The Sea Peoples did not need to lay siege to every city. They only needed to make the connections between those cities too dangerous to maintain. By controlling, or more accurately, by terrorizing the seas, they could strangle an empire without ever marching on its capital. The wealth of the Bronze Age palatial systems was not stored primarily in vaults. It was in motion, perpetually circulating along these maritime highways. A king's prestige was demonstrated through the flow of exotic goods into his court, and his power was funded by taxes on that flow. Sever the flow, and you evaporate both the symbol and the substance of his rule. The palaces, for all their granaries and archives, were endpoints in a network. The pirates attacked the network itself. This historical lesson echoes far beyond the ancient Mediterranean. It establishes a principle that would shape of geopolitics, that he who controls the seas controls the fate of nations. The ability to protect commerce, or to choke it off, remains one of the ultimate expressions of power. The ghostly fleets of the Sea Peoples, then, teach us a chillingly modern lesson, that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a sword that takes a life, but a fear that stops a ship from ever leaving port. A city can withstand an army, but what happens when the tide is made of families? The demographic hypothesis shifts our focus from organized fleets to a more fundamental human force, the relentless search for a home when your own can no longer support you. This theory suggests that behind the names on the Egyptian monuments were not professional soldiers, but ordinary communities pushed to the brink by pressures they could not control. Imagine the hinterlands of Anatolia or the islands of the Aegean, a generation before the Great Collapse. Archaeological evidence points to significant population growth in some of these regions during the preceding centuries. More people meant more mouths to feed from the same patches of farmland, a delicate balance that depended entirely on predictable weather and stable harvests. Then, the climate shifted. The prolonged droughts revealed by tree rings and ice cores turned that delicate balance into a crisis. Springs ran dry, crops withered in the fields, and storerooms that were once full grew dangerously empty. This combination, a growing population meeting a shrinking resource base, creates an unstoppable engine for migration. It is a simple, powerful equation of survival. When the land can no longer sustain you, you must find new land or perish. This was the immense push factor that may have set entire cultures in motion. These were not planned invasions with maps and strategic objectives. They were desperate journeys of necessity. Some groups might have moved peacefully at first, seeking permission to settle in less affected areas, perhaps offering their services as mercenaries in exchange for food and shelter. Others, facing closed borders or hostile reception, would have had no choice but to take what they needed by force. The distinction between a migrant family in an ox cart and a raiding party becomes tragically blurred when the alternative is starvation. This human tide would have flowed along the paths of least resistance, following river valleys and coastlines, inevitably washing up against the fortified borders of the great kingdoms. And here we encounter the fatal weakness of the late Bronze Age state. These empires were bureaucratic giants, excellent at managing predictable systems like annual grain quotas or standardized trade, but utterly inept at handling sudden, large-scale humanitarian crises. Their border defenses were designed to repel military incursions, not to process thousands of desperate, displaced people. Their administrative machinery, built on clay tablets and census lists, could not comprehend or respond to the chaotic, fluid reality of mass migration. A Hittite frontier official might be trained to assess tariffs on merchant caravans or to dispatch a regiment to quell a local rebellion. He had no protocol for 1,000 hungry families arriving at his gate, their belongings piled high, asking not for conquest, but simply for a place to plant seeds. The collision was inevitable, and it was catastrophic. The settled kingdoms, already strained by the same climatic stresses and their own internal tensions, saw these moving populations not as refugees, but as an invading horde. Every attempt to block their passage, every skirmish at a frontier outpost, would have turned more of the migrants into combatants, hardening their desperation into a collective will to fight through. What began as a search for sustenance became a struggle for survival against the very states that barred the way. This friction explains the scale and the simultaneity of the collapse better than any theory of a unified naval command. Multiple migratory waves, originating from different pressure points across the Aegean and Anatolia, would have lapped against the shores of the eastern Mediterranean around the same time. Each one weakening the defensive fabric of the empires a little more. A kingdom like the Hittites, trying to manage drought at home, could not also sustain a permanent military mobilization on all its borders to hold back these human waves. The system overloaded, and then it shattered. This demographic lens does not excuse violence, but it grounds a world historical event in a deeply relatable human experience. It reminds us that the most earth-shaking events are often driven by the most basic needs, for food, for water, for a future for one's children. The sea peoples in this light cease to be a mysterious, demonic force. They become a poignant and terrifying symbol of what happens when the environment changes, when civilizations fail to adapt, and when the sheer weight of human need crashes against the walls of a world that has no room left to give. The burning of a temple was more than the loss of a building. It was a rupture in reality itself. For the people of the late Bronze Age, the great palaces and sanctuaries were not merely seats of power, they were the anchors of cosmic order. Within their walls, priests performed rituals that kept the sun on its course and the seasons in their turn. The king, whether a pharaoh or a Mycenaean, was not just a ruler, he was the god's own representative on earth, the linchpin holding chaos at bay. His prosperity and military success were the ultimate proof of divine favor, a sacred contract between heaven and the state. Then, in a terrifyingly short span of time, that contract was broken. The homes of the gods were set ablaze by faceless attackers from beyond the known world. The king's armies could not stop them. The priest's prayers went unanswered. This was not just a military defeat, it was an ideological cataclysm. The entire framework for understanding the universe, for believing in safety and purpose, collapsed along with the stone walls. In Egypt, the trauma was profound but managed. Pharaoh III could claim victory at, positioning himself as the savior who restored the principle of cosmic truth and order, from the chaos of foreign invasion. Yet the cracks in this divine facade were already showing. The state's later inability to pay its own tomb workers, leading to history's first recorded strike, was a quiet but devastating rebuttal to the idea of an all-providing, infallible god-king. If the pharaoh could not ensure bread for his most sacred artisans, how could he truly guarantee the Nile's flood or the sun's rise? His divine authority, though outwardly intact, had been fundamentally questioned by the harsh realities of a broken economic world. The psychological impact elsewhere was even more absolute. In the Mycenaean world, the institution of the palace king, who served as both political leader and high priest, vanished completely. The cult centers within the palaces were abandoned, their rituals forgotten. The intricate religious iconography on frescoes and seals, depicting goddesses and griffins, ceased to be produced. It was as if the spiritual language of an entire civilization was suddenly erased. For the survivors huddling in smaller villages amidst the ruins, the old gods had clearly failed. The deities who were supposed to protect the palace and its people had let them be consumed by fire. This created a vacuum of belief, a deep and unsettling silence where once there had been ceremony and certainty. In this hollowed-out spiritual landscape, new ideas could take root. The crisis may have accelerated a shift from the formal, state-controlled religion of the palaces toward more personal, accessible, or localized forms of worship. It is perhaps no coincidence that, in the centuries following the collapse, across the fractured Mediterranean, we see the rise of cults focused on mystery, on deities of the underworld and regeneration. Themes that resonate with the experience of catastrophic loss and a desperate hope for rebirth. The ideological upheaval also paved the way for new social contracts. When the divine right of kings burned in the palace it opened space for other forms of community. The later Greek city-state, the polis, would not be centered on a god-king but on a collective identity of citizens. In the Levant, the emerging Israelite identity would famously reject the model of a human king for generations, defining itself instead by a covenant directly with a single god. A theological revolution that may have been unthinkable under the shadow of the great imperial cults. The attacks by the Sea Peoples, therefore, struck at more than cities and trade routes. They delivered a blow to the very psyche of the age, severing the link between political power and divine mandate. The trauma of watching the invincible become vulnerable, of seeing the eternal order prove fleeting, forced a profound reimagining of humanity's place in the world. From the ashes of that crisis of belief, quieter, more resilient, and ultimately transformative ideas about community, authority, and the divine began slowly to grow. The names Sardinia and Sicily are not modern inventions, they are ancient echoes. When Egyptian scribes carved the words and into stone, they were documenting a present threat, not naming far-off islands. Yet the phonetic resemblance is too striking to ignore, a coincidence that hangs in the air like a question. Could these warriors have come from, or eventually settled, those western lands? This clue sends the investigation spinning away from the eastern palaces, out across the open Mediterranean toward its distant, sun-drenched shores. On the island of Sardinia, a unique and powerful culture had flourished for centuries, the civilization. They left behind no deciphered writings, but their legacy is written in stone and bronze. Across the Sardinian landscape stand thousands of massive conical towers built of cyclopean blocks, silent sentinels of a sophisticated society. From this world, archaeologists have recovered small, intricate bronze figurines. They depict warriors, and the details are arresting. Some wear horned helmets, others carry round shields and long swords. To many observers, they bear an uncanny resemblance to the depictions of Sea People's fighters on Egyptian temple walls. The timing is provocative. These figurines date to roughly the same era as the Great Collapse. Could they represent the very warriors who sailed east to raid the coasts of empires? Or do they simply show a shared pan-Mediterranean style of warfare? The bronze itself tells a story of connection. Sardinia was rich in copper, a vital component of the Bronze Age world. It is entirely plausible that traders or mercenaries traveled east, integrating into the complex networks of the time. A warrior serving as a mercenary in Pharaoh's army, as earlier records show, might have originally come from such a background. The theory becomes even more intriguing when reversed. Some scholars propose a circular migration. Imagine groups originating in the Western Mediterranean, perhaps from Sardinia or the Italian peninsula, journeying eastward for trade or employment. They become enmeshed in the Eastern world, their names recorded by Egyptians. Then, when the collapse unleashes chaos, some of these groups, or others fleeing the destruction, sail back westward, returning to or settling islands that would later bear their names. In this scenario, the names are not labels for the islands themselves, but for the peoples who came from them or who eventually gave their names to them centuries later. Sicily adds another layer. The island's indigenous peoples were later influenced by migrations from the Italian mainland. Could the name preserve the memory of an early group, who themselves may have been part of these vast population movements? The archaeology here is less clear-cut than the bronzes of Sardinia, but the linguistic thread remains tantalizing. This Western thread does not provide a definitive answer, but it dramatically expands the stage. It pushes the geography of the collapse from a regional crisis in the Eastern Mediterranean to a phenomenon that potentially spanned the entire sea. It suggests the networks of the Late Bronze Age were even vaster than we knew, with goods, ideas, and people circulating in all directions. The warriors who appeared at the mouth of the Nile may have begun their journeys under the shadow of Sardinian stone towers or Sicilian volcanoes. Their story links the fate of pharaohs to the fortunes of island chiefs 1,000 miles away. This connection transforms the mystery from a linear invasion into a web of reciprocal movement, where the Mediterranean was not a barrier, but a highway for ambition, desperation, and the relentless human search for a place in the world. The story of the Sea Peoples is not just an ancient mystery, it is a modern one as well, shaped as much by the historians who tell it as by the evidence they uncover. How we understand these shadowy figures has changed dramatically over the last century, a reflection not only of new discoveries, but of the changing worldviews of the scholars themselves. In the early 1900s, Against the backdrop of a Europe still processing the colossal upheaval of the First World War, historians saw a familiar pattern in the distant past. They looked at the burning cities and the Egyptian war reliefs and saw a clear, cataclysmic narrative, a definitive invasion by a unified foreign horde that swept away a decadent old order. This interpretation, often called the invasion hypothesis, was clean, dramatic, and satisfying. It framed the Sea Peoples as the barbarians at the gate, a historical punctuation mark that clearly separated one age from the next. This view was heavily influenced by the classical stories of later barbarian migrations that toppled Rome, a powerful analogy that made the ancient collapse feel comprehensible through a more recent lens. For these early scholars, the Sea Peoples were a prime mover, a cause rather than a consequence. Yet this interpretation often carried subtle, unspoken baggage. In an age of high imperialism and nationalism, the idea of civilized empires falling to waves of less sophisticated outsiders reinforced certain contemporary anxieties and beliefs about order, civilization, and its perceived enemies. The story was told in a way that made historical sense to the people telling it, a narrative of clear-cut conflict between us and them. The mid-20th century, however, began to chip away at this monolithic view. As archaeology became more scientific, focusing on stratigraphy and pottery sequences rather than just hunting for treasure, a more complex picture emerged. Researchers started noticing that the destruction layers were not perfectly simultaneous, that recovery began at different paces in different places, and that the old empires showed signs of internal strain long before the first foreign ship was sighted. This led to a significant shift in thinking. Perhaps the Sea Peoples were not the single cause, but one symptom among many in a wider systemic failure. The rise of environmental science provided a crucial new piece, with data from tree rings and ice cores pointing to severe, prolonged drought. This gave birth to the system's collapse theory, where climate change, famine, internal rebellion, and trade disruption created a domino effect. In this model, the Sea Peoples might be desperate climate refugees or opportunistic pirates, moving into power vacuums rather than creating them. This was a move from a story about villains to a story about a perfect storm of vulnerabilities. The most recent scholarship has pushed this even further, influenced by postmodern thought that questions grand narratives and emphasizes complexity. Some contemporary historians and archaeologists now argue that the very category of Sea Peoples is a modern, and perhaps misleading, construction. They point out that we have no evidence these diverse groups saw themselves as a unified coalition. The term, they suggest, is an Egyptian propaganda tool that we have mistakenly into a historical actor. This view minimizes their role as a primary driver, seeing them instead as a spectral symbol of the chaos that emerges when complex systems break down. The debate is far from settled, and it reveals a profound truth about the study of history itself. Our interpretation of the past is never a pure reflection of facts. It is a conversation between those facts and the preoccupations of our own time. In eras worried about border security and migration, the narrative of invading hordes gains resonance. In an age concerned with climate change and global interdependence, the system's collapse model feels urgently relevant. The Sea Peoples have become a historical canvas, a test upon which each generation projects its own understanding of how civilizations fail. This does not mean the truth is unreachable, but it does require intellectual humility. It reminds us that history is not merely a process of discovery, but one of construction. We assemble fragments into a story, and the shape of that story is guided by the questions we dare to ask. The enduring mystery of the Sea Peoples, therefore, lies not only in the silent ashes of, but in the quiet hum of the modern university, where the past is continually being rewritten. One careful interpretation at a time. Despite all we have pieced together, the Sea Peoples remain wrapped in profound enigmas. The most basic questions about them still lack definitive answers, creating a borderland between history and mystery. Where exactly did the major groups like the or the begin their journeys? We have tantalizing clues from pottery and linguistic echoes, pointing to the Aegean, Anatolia, or the central Mediterranean, but a precise homeland for any single group remains frustratingly out of reach. This ambiguity feeds into a larger puzzle. Were they a unified coalition with a shared goal, or simply separate bands of migrants and raiders, whose attacks happened to coincide in a perfect storm of bad timing? The Egyptian records present them as a collective enemy, but that could be a simplification for the temple walls, a way to make a chaotic reality feel like a single threat. We can trace some, like the Philistines, to their new settlements, but what was the ultimate fate of the others after their defeats? Did the or the simply dissolve, absorbed into other populations, their identities fading like footprints in wet sand? And why did the crisis produce such wildly different outcomes? The Phoenician cities, though battered, not only survived, but unlocked a new age of maritime enterprise, while the mighty Hittite imperial identity vanished completely. Was it geography, leadership, sheer luck, or a deeper cultural adaptability that determined who would rise from the ashes? Perhaps the most telling gap in our knowledge is the absence of a single, undeniable artifact we could call a smoking sail. Imagine discovering a shipwreck from this era, its hull construction unique, its cargo a mix of personal belongings and loot, its insignia matching the helmets carved at. Or a settlement site along the migratory route, with clear cultural links to both the Aegean and the Levant, frozen in a moment of transition. No such definitive time capsule has yet been found. Every piece of evidence is circumstantial, open to interpretation. This lack of a clear signature is what keeps the debate alive and vigorous. Yet these lingering questions are not failures of history. They are its engine. Every unresolved riddle is an open invitation, a challenge that drives archaeologists to sift another layer of soil, linguists to re-examine an ancient syllable, and climatologists to refine their models of ancient droughts. The persistent enigmas surrounding the Sea Peoples are a powerful reminder that the past refuses to be neat. It is often more ambiguous, more complex, and more wonderfully mysterious than our tidy narratives would like it to be. In that space of uncertainty, the real work of discovery continues. A monopoly on knowledge is a powerful form of control. In the stable world of the great Bronze Age empires, certain technologies were not just valuable, they were state secrets. The Hittites, masters of the Anatolian highlands, held one of the most crucial, the advanced smelting and forging of iron. This was not the common, brittle metal of earlier times, but a workable, superior material. They guarded this knowledge closely, a strategic advantage that reinforced their military might and their economic leverage. Iron was a treasure of the palace, its production tightly controlled by the royal workshop and its skilled artisans bound to the king. This was the old order, where innovation was hoarded by the powerful, a privilege of the center. Then the center vanished. When fell and the Hittite imperial administration dissolved, those bonds of secrecy were severed. The palace smiths, the keepers of the flame, were suddenly adrift. Some may have fled the burning capital with their families, carrying their skills as their most precious possession. Others might have been captured by invading groups, their expertise now a prize of war. In the chaotic exodus that followed the collapse, these master craftsmen were no longer servants of a single king. They became itinerant experts, their knowledge a commodity to be traded for food, shelter, or safe passage. Wherever they settled, whether in a fledgling Aramean town in Syria or a resurgent village in the Levant, they planted the seeds of a technological revolution. The secret was out, and it could not be put back in the bottle. This pattern of forced diffusion repeated across the shattered landscape. Consider the art of shipbuilding. The distinct, high-prowed vessels used by the sea peoples, effective for open-sea raiding and transport, represented a specific maritime technology. When these groups settled, as the Philistines did on the Canaanite coast, they did not arrive alone. Their ships and the shipwrights who built them came with them. In the mixed ports of the post-collapse world, these designs would have interacted with surviving local nautical traditions. A Canaanite carpenter might learn a new technique for reinforcing a hull from a settler whose ancestors sailed from the Aegean. This fusion of knowledge, born from necessity and proximity, gradually produced sturdier, more versatile ships, the very vessels that would later empower the Phoenician expansion. Even artistic styles, those silent markers of identity, began to blend and cross-pollinate in this melting pot of migration. The spiral patterns on Philistine pottery did not stay purely Aegean for long. Within a generation or two, local Canaanite motifs appeared alongside them, creating a vibrant, hybrid aesthetic. This was not a dilution, but an innovation born of contact. The crisis acted as a great, if brutal, mixer of cultures. It broke populations from their traditional homelands and threw them together in new configurations, where a potter from one tradition might marry a weaver from another. And their children would inherit a blended artistic vocabulary. This period of profound instability, therefore, had a paradoxical effect. While it destroyed political structures and economic networks, it dramatically accelerated the exchange of practical knowledge. The old barriers, the borders and royal decrees that had compartmentalized innovation, were swept away. In their place arose a messy, decentralized, and incredibly fertile environment for technological sharing. The superior iron plows that would eventually till the fields of 100 small kingdoms, the iron swords that would equip their militias, even the alphabetic scripts that would record their laws. All benefited from this democratization of know-how. The destructive passage of the sea peoples and the migrations they spurred acted as an inadvertent vector, a painful but effective delivery system for the very tools that would build the next world. The catastrophe did not just clear the ground, it scattered the seeds. Smoke on the horizon was not a sign of distant war, but the end of a world. For the farmer tilling his family's plot outside Ugarit, that dark column rising from the coast meant the ships had finally come. His story and the stories of millions like him are the silent heart of the collapse, written not in royal inscriptions, but in the urgent, frightened archaeology of everyday life. We find their traces in places where history stopped suddenly. At the site of Tel Ez, ancient, archaeologists uncovered a layer of destruction so complete it sealed a moment in time. Within the ruins of a single house, they found the remains of a woman caught in the collapse of the building. Nearby lay a loom weight, a simple tool for weaving cloth, a fragment of a domestic life violently interrupted. This is not a king on a battlefield, this is a person in her home. In other places, we find evidence of communities that simply vanished. Villages in the highlands of Greece or on the coasts of Anatolia were abandoned, their pottery left on the floors, their tools still by the hearths. These were not orderly retreats, they were panicked flights, people grabbing what they could carry and fleeing into an uncertain hinterland, leaving everything else behind as a silent testament to their fear. For the merchant, the collapse was an economic apocalypse. The intricate trade routes that had been the arteries of his livelihood and his identity simply dissolved. A Cypriot trader who once sailed with holds full of copper ingots now found the ports of Syria and Egypt closed, either in ruins or under a perpetual shadow of danger. His carefully maintained network of contacts and credits became worthless. The stable prices, the predictable demand, the safe passages guaranteed by royal power all evaporated. He was left with a ship he dared not sail and a skill set that had no market in a shattered world. His profession, and the cosmopolitan identity that came with it, was rendered obsolete overnight. Then there were the refugees, the human tide set in motion by the converging crises. Picture a family from the parched highlands of Anatolia. Their crops failed for the third straight year. They bundle their few possessions into an ox cart, their most precious heirlooms and some seed grain for a future they cannot see. They join a stream of other desperate people, moving slowly toward the coast, hoping the sea might offer a path to survival. They are not warriors by choice, but necessity may force them to become fighters, to take food and shelter from others just to see their children live another day. These are the people who might later be labeled, collectively and ominously, as sea peoples. Their journey is one of profound loss, a severing from ancestral lands and the familiar spirits of place that define their world. The psychological toll of this displacement is almost beyond measure. They carried with them the trauma of watching their home burn, the grief for those left behind or lost on the dangerous journey, and the deep anxiety of arriving as strangers in a land that did not want them. Their resilience was born of sheer desperation, a stubborn will to forge a new identity from the fragments of the old. This human scale of the disaster reframes the entire narrative. The burning of a palace is a historical event. The scattering of its people, the extinction of its language, the unraveling of the stories that told families who they were, that is a human tragedy of immense depth. The collapse was not a single moment, but a long, grinding period of hardship, where famine and illness traveled alongside the marching groups and the sailing fleets. Communities that had known generations of stability were thrust into a brutal struggle for the most basic necessities. Yet, within this darkness, we also see flickers of that resilience. The refugee family that finally settled, perhaps among the Philistine cities, and slowly, painstakingly, began to build again. They mixed their pottery styles with those of their new neighbors. They buried their dead with a blend of old customs and new influences. They learned a new language while keeping the melodies of old lullabies alive in their homes. They were not just victims of history, they were its survivors, the ones who would carry shards of the lost world into the future and piece them into something new. To focus only on empires and invaders is to miss the profound truth of this era. The true cost of the late Bronze Age collapse was paid in individual lives, in broken families, in silenced voices, and in the quiet, enduring courage of those who had no choice but to begin again. Their unrecorded struggles are the deepest layer of this history, a reminder that behind every fallen wall, there was once a home. The detective work of history is no longer confined to libraries and excavation trenches. Today, a revolution in scientific archaeology is offering us a new kind of evidence, one that can read the stories locked inside a single tooth or a grain of pollen, promising to answer questions that texts and pottery alone cannot resolve. This is where the mystery of the Sea Peoples meets the cutting edge of 21st century science, transforming a centuries-old debate with data of astonishing precision. Consider the power of isotope analysis. When we drink water or eat food grown in a particular region, Our bodies incorporate unique chemical signatures from that local environment into our tissues, especially into the enamel of our teeth, which forms in childhood and remains unchanged. By analyzing the strontium and oxygen isotopes in the teeth of individuals found in ancient graves, scientists can now determine where that person spent their early years. Imagine applying this technique to a mass burial site dating to the era of the collapse. If we found a group of warriors with isotopic signatures pointing to the Aegean or Sardinia buried on the coast of Canaan, it would provide direct, physical proof of foreign fighters present at the moment of destruction. Moving the discussion from suggestive pottery styles to the biography of a single individual, even more transformative is the field of the study of ancient DNA. By extracting genetic material from skeletal remains, researchers can now trace deep ancestral lineages and population mixtures. This tool could finally map the migrations of the era with genetic clarity. Did the people buried in early Philistine cemeteries carry a significant genetic component linking them to populations in the Aegean? Does the DNA from sites in Anatolia after the fall of show a sudden influx of new groups from the north or west? This technology moves beyond cultural artifacts to trace the movement of people themselves, offering a biological map of the upheaval. It can tell us not just about pots and swords, but about families and their journeys. Our understanding of the environmental backdrop is also being refined with remarkable detail. Advanced climate models, fed by data from ice cores, lake sediments, and tree ring archives, are no longer just identifying a period of drought. They are beginning to reconstruct its specific geography, duration, and intensity. Scientists can now ask, did the drought begin earlier in Anatolia than in Greece? How severe was the aridity in the Levant compared to the Nile Delta? This granular climatic picture allows historians to test theories of cause and effect with far greater accuracy. Modeling how crop failures might have triggered specific population movements from one valley to the next, turning the vague notion of climate stress into a detailed timeline of environmental pressure. And then there is the dream discovery, the one that could change everything, a shipwreck. The development of sophisticated underwater remote sensing, like autonomous vehicles and high-resolution sonar, is systematically scanning the Mediterranean seabed. The discovery of a vessel from the late 13th century before the Common Era, particularly one with a cargo of weapons, personal effects, and a unique hull design, would be a time capsule of unparalleled value. It could confirm the seafaring technology of these groups, reveal what they carried with them, and provide a direct, unmediated artifact of their world, untouched by the biases of the scribes who wrote about them. Together, these tools represent a fundamental shift. For over a century, the debate has rested on interpreting ambiguous texts and analyzing the style of broken pottery. Now science offers the possibility of concrete answers. It can tell us where someone was born, who their ancestors were, exactly how dry the summers were, and what their ships looked like. Each new technique writes a fresh paragraph in a story we thought was complete. The narrative of the Sea Peoples and the Great Collapse is no longer a closed book written in stone and clay. It is an open file, constantly being updated with new evidence, a reminder that the final word on the past is always waiting for the next discovery. Their saga is a testament to the fragility of even the most magnificent civilizations. These mysterious seafarers were likely both a cause and a consequence of the age's end, a catalyst that exploited and accelerated a breakdown long in the making. A world stretched thin by climate shifts, rigid economic ties, and mounting internal pressures could not withstand the shock of their arrival. They did not act alone, but their attacks severed the last threads holding a complex system together. The legacy they left behind is profoundly dual, a story written in both ashes and new foundations. On one hand, their passage was a force of terrifying destruction. The fires they set or ignited plunged the Mediterranean into a profound silence, a dark age where writing was forgotten, and grand palaces became the stuff of legend. For centuries, the vibrant connections of the international age were lost, replaced by isolation and a struggle for mere survival. Yet from that same chaos sprang an era of unintended renewal. The collapse of the old monopolies on knowledge and power cleared the ground for a remarkable rebirth. The tightly guarded secret of ironworking spread, democratizing a stronger technology. The political vacuum allowed nimble new states, like the Phoenician cities and Aramaean kingdoms, to rise, building their power on trade and cultural influence rather than sheer imperial might. In the hills of Canaan, new identities took root, while across the Aegean, the fragmented communities would one day coalesce into the classical Greek world. This pivotal moment teaches us that history is not a straight line of progress, but a cycle of constant change, where collapse and rebirth are deeply intertwined. The end of one story is often the difficult, necessary beginning of the next. The most mysterious forces, whether a changing climate or fleets on a distant horizon, can reshape the destiny of the world, reminding us that resilience is found not in resisting change, but in the enduring human capacity to build again from what remains.